One of the most important choices that you have meant to make is, who are your co-founders? Who are you choosing to build this company with? Do you trust them? Do you like them? You're going to spend a lot of time together. You're going to get mad at each other. Can you communicate? All of those things that are entirely unrelated to the technology, etc. And there's plenty of statistics out there, but I've seen it enough, is that the large majority of therapies not reaching to the clinic are business failures, not technology failures. And we can see that at large scale, large tech, to small, medium, those that never even got kickstarted off. And a large majority and portion of those is predicated on the team that you build.
This is the Nucleate Podcast, the voice of the next generation of biotech leaders.
Welcome to the Nucleate Podcast. My name is Sam Kessel, and on this episode, Anastasia Yanas and I interview the leadership of Persephoni BioPartners, a venture studio and consulting firm that helps early-stage biotech startups transition from academic research to commercialization. Hilary Schultz has her master's degree and is the co-founder and CEO of Persephoni. She has a background in private equity, venture capital, and biotechnology. Hilary holds a molecular biology degree from Harvard University and a master's in biomedicine and business from Drexel University College of Medicine. Previously, Hilary served as founding executive vice president of organizational development at Nucleate, where she expanded our program globally, helping alumni raise over $170 million, create 121 biotech jobs, and form 175 venture teams. At Persephoni, she focuses on supporting founders through company formation, fundraising, and intellectual property management, with a goal of raising $100 million for Philadelphia-based biotech ventures. Dr. William Heath is the Chief Scientific Officer at Persephoni BioPartners and a veteran of over 36 years in pharmaceutical R&D. He earned his PhD in biochemistry from the Rockefeller University and completed postdoctoral research at Harvard Medical School. As Group Vice President at Eli Lilly and Company, he led global efforts in drug discovery and development across multiple therapeutic areas. Together, Hilary and Dr. Heath lead Persephoni in bridging the gap between academia and industry, helping biotech innovators de-risk their assets, accelerate commercialization, and bring breakthrough therapies to market.
Thank you for joining the Nucleate Podcast, Hilary and Bill.
Well, we're happy to be here. It's like coming home.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be here.
Amazing. So the topic of our podcast today, of the episode, is what happens after Nucleate, which is of interest for a lot of our listeners. And we are very happy to dive into what you're doing and your thoughts about that, and also talking a little bit about Nucleate and, Hilary, your experience with Nucleate while being a part of Nucleate, or a very active part of Nucleate. But before we go into all these topics, let's go to the beginning. So let's start with you, Hilary. You have a very broad academic journey, and it was incredibly diverse. You started with molecular biology at Harvard, then you went to Harvard Business School, and you then completed Master's in Molecular Medicine, Biomedicine at Drexel University. So let's go back to you being a young girl and deciding what you want to do in your life. So what first sparked your passion for science? Was there a pivotal moment where you realized that this is what you want to do? Some of our guests tell about some failed experiments when they were young in their rooms. So any of that kind?
No, thank you for that. I would say that I'd always pursued and wanted to be a clinician. So like both of you being trained clinicians. And I was at Utah State, was a pre-medical student, and then I had an opportunity to go on a medical mission in Honduras. I speak Spanish fluently, and I thought that would be wonderful to serve. And while being there, I saw in practice as a clinician and translating for the clinician this moment where I realized that in that situation, that clinician can only help that one patient on the table. And I saw that in me and who I am as an individual, at kind of understanding my desires of impacting like human health. And so I ended up being the medical director for that nonprofit for 2 years in Honduras. and then saw that the rate limiters were really around financing and access to capital. And so I pivoted then to for-profit business, actually before finishing my academic graduate studies for 8.5 years, and built other phenotypes of companies outside of life sciences.
Yeah, that's a very amazing insight. Also, a lot of physicians that they tell, oh, I can help just this one patient only. And that's why I want to use my knowledge and use my skills that I train on and apply them in a broader ecosystem. And also, I'm trying to have a bigger impact than this one patient at a time, which is great as well, but you aim bigger. So this leads me to the second question. Did you have any specific area in mind, or did you have a big goal on this is what I want to solve while in my life?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And like speaking onto like a pivotal moment, I actually recently remembered this. In high school, so I'm going way back, we were at a leadership camp, and this is kind of silly, but we were at leadership camp, and they asked the questions, if you had a superpower, what superpower would you want? And some of our colleagues were like, I want to fly, I want to be able to swim under the water. And I was 14, and the first thing that came to mind is like, I would want to heal, right? Like heal, like in medically, human health. And so it's always been ingrained in me. I think the pivot was more along the lines of like my nature of being an entrepreneur is that when you're immersed in situations, I naturally have this affinity to improve a system or see something where something can become better. And I think that's where, in a clinician, I found that through that immersion, the solutions are started years, if not decades, ahead of what a clinician can provide to a patient. And so I wanted to get earlier on that trajectory in the kind of translational piece.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we'll dive into that in a bit, but let's turn to Bill. Actually, the same question. So you did your PhD in biochemistry, and then you did a postdoc in Harvard Medical School. Same question. What drove you to science? What drove you to biochemistry? And what was your big goal, or was there a big goal when you were starting off?
Yeah, well, so I'm a little bit older than all of you guys. So I grew up in the 1960s, believe it or not. And it was a time when science was really seen as the solution to humanity's challenges. And so I told my parents when I was 6 years old that I wanted to become a scientist. I didn't really know what that entailed, but I still remember that conversation. They were a little surprised. And of course, I'm a first generation college student. So my father just immediately concluded that I should go to medical school. And I'm like, no, I don't want to go to medical school. I want to be a scientist, which I think over the years he accommodated himself to. But over time, I actually became quite interested in this idea as I gained a little bit more perspective about how one could actually leverage science in the pursuit of improving human lives. And so that is actually what drove me through college to graduate school and ultimately into industry. And, it was a journey where I was pre-internet. So your information sources were much less, but it was always kind of like this North Star, if you will. And, I started life as a chemist. But I love biology as well. And so I just decided that I wasn't going to choose between the two. So nowadays that's pretty common, but back then it was very unusual that someone would go from chemistry to biochemistry to cell biology. And so I joined industry with sort of like this very diverse background, which served me quite well in terms of being able to work on problems. But it was fairly atypical, but it's kind of the hallmark of my career in that I want to do the journey my way, and I'm not going to apologize for my interests, so to speak. And that's kind of sort of the genesis of much of what I've done in my career, is to basically just follow my curiosity and try to make things better for people.
It makes a lot of sense. What advice would you give to our listeners or anyone who is right now starting off their career and maybe like yourself, they have so many different interests, and right now our society also evolves to accepting that you are pivoting to different areas, but sometimes you always hear this, like for instance, I did my medical school. I thought I wanted to become a neurosurgeon. At some point I realized I want to do something else and I have other interests. And when I talk to my colleagues and my medical school peers about this, they did not understand this. So at some point, it told me that I'm throwing that away that I trained for. So what would you tell our listeners who are, kind of thinking about doing something else because this is of their interest, but the larger society tells them that it might be a mistake?
Well, I can start if you would like, Hilary. I talk to a lot of students who are actually wrestling with this same question. And I always remind people to follow their passion and do the things that are important to them and not be caught up in conventional wisdom. I said the one thing that you don't want to have at the end of your journey in life or even at the end of a career is to look back and realize that you did not do the things that you really wanted to do. Because life is uncertain, and along the way, you will discover many wonderful things. But to this comment about wasting your training, much of what we learn in school actually doesn't get utilized on a daily basis. So we all learned calculus most likely, and none of us probably use calculus on a daily basis, but we understand how it fits in. You have to think about your training like the foundation of a house. Every house needs a foundation. What kind of house you build and how you remodel that house over time is kind of up to you and what works in the context of the groups that you're working with as well. But I always kind of bristle when I hear that people are told that they should not follow their hearts, so to speak. And, I think that Hilary and I, in some ways, are very much alike in terms of finding that North Star and then not worrying about what society thought about that path. It's kind of like what you think about it is what's important.
No, certainly. And I would add to that, and even speaking on just in the pursuit of it, say as a dual degree MD, PhD, I think as we've interfaced with inventors and even in our approach in preclinical development and lending to, you could have a great molecule, but does it have a viability in a clinical setting of a prescriber prescribing and a patient taking it? And so, we build backwards. And I think as a trained scientist, but also clinician, that is a huge value in the skills that are, trained in medical school. And if you conducted rotations, I think it's an incredible value to understand the downstream healthcare adoption from a patient to clinician interface is hugely valuable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So when you're actually developing some solutions that you have the end user in mind, so the patients, and also thinking about stuff like how it will affect the life quality of the patient, and not just will it extend their life expectancy by so many months. Okay, so let's continue. We said before this episode, it's a little bit about Nucleate and what happens afterwards, but let's start with what happened at Nucleate. And Hilary, especially, you played a pivotal role in scaling Nucleate globally. You did a lot of amazing things within Nucleate, and it's a actively growing community. There is so much going on within the Nucleate ecospace. So what would you give as advice to young scientists or those who go through the Activator program, how to make the most time at Nucleate?
No, thank you. And I cherished my time at Nucleate, and I think it's an incredible organization. And I would say the greatest value looking back right now is one being immersed in even globally or in a call it bioecosystem nature, like seeing the pain points around early translation of the support needed or the key decision making to be had from inventors that want to exit. But I would say the greatest value is the network. So I would encourage anyone both volunteering and supporting Nucleate from an internal perspective, but also those through the Activator, leveraging every opportunity that you have to build your network. Because the next steps will be various. It'll be career, it'll be industry, it could be a biotech startup. And that network you establish here, the fellows that leave Nucleate that are in venture fellowships at VC, potentially someday are decisionaries in VC funds. And there could be this like a exponential or multiplication of value off of not just your time participating, but also from the network that you establish. So I would say, if anything at all, get uncomfortable being uncomfortable. So if you're shy and you do not want to reach out, you have ample platform right now via Slack and all the many channels I know you're probably in Slack. But reach out and make those connections. And also those industry participants. For example, it was due to Nucleate that I met Bill. And it was because I took an opportunity to go to a Nucleate event after I departed and participated with an Eli Lilly event and built a relationship, not just because of Nucleate, but just as individuals and sharing careers and pursuits. So you never know what's going to happen or what seeds you're planting right now.
Bill, you spent a lot of time at Eli Lilly, and Hilary just mentioned that you met through this event. So how can you give us your perspective on why you thought Nucleate or the collaboration with Nucleate was valuable, and sorry, I'll rephrase. So what advantage brought it to you and Eli Lilly?
Well, I mean, I have a strong passion for developing talent and also trying to unlock the potential in early career professionals, starting back with students. I actually discovered Nucleate by accident via LinkedIn. I actually ran across a few of the founders, Oliver, Suf, a few others, who had this Nucleate logo on their LinkedIn profile. And I'm like, what is this? And so I actually had the good fortune to be able to chat with them. And I'm like, this is an incredible concept. How can I help? And so I ended up sort of joining as a mentor and worked with some groups over time. But then also I decided to actually advocate with the leader of R&D at Lilly that we should actually become formally engaged as a company, because I actually saw this as a way of not only contributing to the community, but also understanding what was evolving in the ecosystem as well. And so, that's what actually led to Lilly starting to do these grand challenges. They've now done 2. They actually invited me back, even though I had retired to this latest one. And it's just been incredible to just see the growth of Nucleate. I remember Oliver telling me about the plans to go international. And I was like, this sounds pretty audacious. And voila, it happened. And then to see sort of like the multiplier effect where regions were basically jumping in, even though they weren't probably part of the original plan, and sort of raising their hands and saying, we want to be part of Nucleate. It's just been really awesome to see. And so wanting to actually find ways to continue to help that early scene, but also my participation may be very mindful of the continuing challenges that people face as they look to transition from more of an academic sort of environment to thinking about how do you move ideas to reality. Mm-hmm. And I'm a big believer in this concept of ideas becoming medicines or therapies, if you will. And so that's also what sort of like fueled my passion to think about what was next for me.
Sounds amazing. And Hilary, you mentioned that Nucleate, it's the network and people that you meet that they're super crucial and part of the Nucleate experience. But from both of your perspectives on that, what skills should young scientists or Nucleate members focus on building that will help them along the way after graduating from Nucleate?
Let's see here. So skill sets, I mean, there's always hard skills, soft skills, right? So you learn to be excellent scientists, create hypotheses, test them, part of which is, planning, management, etc. But a idea will always stay siloed in that studying your focus and thesis unless you learn skill sets on how to collaborate, how to communicate the rationale behind your thought idea. And I think that's one of the biggest rate limiters in the context of translating out of, and say, a spin out. And this could be translating and communicating your skills that you built in an academic setting. If you're targeting an industry, is that, are you learning the communication and skill sets to convey that messaging where persons can understand and clearly understand a value proposition? It's skill sets that are utilized in fundraising all the way throughout, and as it relates to the audience that's receiving it. I've seen a lot of scientists that immediately spin out and they use the dialogue and communication to fundraise predicated on academic language. And that doesn't wholly translate to value the receiver, and ergo difficulties in raising capital. So I would say communication is probably the all-encompassing value, I think, or skill set you can have.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So there's, it's not a running joke, but the scientist focuses on the experiment, the design, and doesn't talk a lot about the future because you're also trained to be a little bit conservative, talking about something that might happen versus as entrepreneur, you need to sell this vision and not just the science. Science is a crucial part of it, but actually focusing on this vision and what it can add as a value and how it fits within the current treatment landscape.
I would say that one of the other things that I would encourage people to do is to move beyond your natural circle and seek out individuals who bring very diverse perspectives to your own. And in particular, find folks who are actually going to challenge your ideas. One of the things that you see with early entrepreneurs is oftentimes they've been living in an echo chamber where they've received certain advice and that kind of aligns with their thinking. But the reality is you're going to go into a bigger world where most people don't agree with your perspective, or they're going to significantly challenge. And you really want those challenges to come early so that you can actually sharpen your argument or your thesis, if you will. And you also want to take advantage of the wisdom of others who actually may understand where some of the sand traps are that you've never been exposed to. And I find at times, particularly both working through Nucleate, but also with these early teams, when you kind of point out some of these issues, there's a little bit of shock because no one else has brought that up. And it's like some of those elements could be fatal flaws to the thesis that could actually stall the program entirely. And it's something I had to learn even early in my career at Lilly, is that rather than just bristle when somebody challenged my ideas or think that people are wrong, is to actually ask the question, why is this very smart person viewing the same set of data and coming to a very different conclusion? Maybe I can learn something from them. I realize that's very hard to do at times. We're all very proud of our ability to sort of like figure things out. And we're usually not that great at actually having our ideas challenged, but it's very valuable to sort of adopt a different mindset, which is, what can I learn here from this orthogonal perspective?
We've actually, and just even to parlay on that, like in our vehicle at Persephoni as a venture studio, currently fully operationalizing 4 companies, soon to be 5. And we were kind of doing some analyses on probability or future things in the partnerships we have going in flight of conveying the value proposition. And we did a temporality exercise of when we found the technology and onboarding it at its current trajectory, and then the delta of how we have set it up for increased value. And some of that, I would say, was related to, the inventor, exceptional scientists, and the technologies. We screened about 200 technologies to select our first 4, but they still had a hyper focus, or call it an academic assessment towards the value. And we know that bias is everywhere. It's pervasive no matter what we're doing. But there was a further attachment to the academic work done in the PhD, and a connection, affiliation, and pursuit of, where we took a step back and looked at a larger lens of what is the true utility and power of this technology, and affirming indication and route of delivery and modality and all of those things downstream. And very quickly, value and impact of that technology increase. And it was a fun exercise to do. And it's even funner to execute together. So I just thought I'd throw that out as, you can get very hyper focused on something and not look at the bigger picture.
And that makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned Persephoni. Let's go back for our listeners and first of all, explain what it is. And I would let you do it because you cannot, I can explain it as well, but I think you would be the better people to do it. And also asking the question, where did you see the gap in the biotech ecosystem that motivated you to start with Persephoni?
Yeah. No, thank you. Great question. So after leaving Nucleate, after Nucleate story, I was an entrepreneur in residence for the state of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth. And part of that charge was to build companies that interface and exit out of academic settings. So I worked with Penn and Wistar and pretty much all of the university settings in Philly and Pittsburgh. And then from there, it also was a call to action to build the supportive resources to support companies, bridging that gap, call it mitigating the valley of death. And one thing that I saw is, as an entrepreneur in residence, as a single person with a colleague of mine, Andrew, who's now with Persephoni, we were not only able to help and support one company, we were able to help support multiple. And then there was this inherent need and this a repeat of occurrences or events that you could see, and it was an opportunity to provide an infrastructure to fill that gap. And that was on the order of licensing terms and agreements and impacts, right? So you have a first-time founder. How do you negotiate terms and agreements? Additionally, how do you get to the right interface with investors to get capital, to get your program kicked off? And that's a very scary place for a recently graduated PhD student to be in a situation where you have gaps in income. And it puts the company at risk and your career at risk. So I saw this and I said, well, if one EIR can support multiple companies, what if we had an architecture where you could have industry professionals come into a vehicle and support more? So we formed Persephoni first as more or less a consultant advisory mechanism, and had various lifts that we would do across those companies in advisory services, fundraising advisory. And then those revenues from that aperture enabled us to form a more traditional venture studio. And so now we've founded soon to be 5 companies, and near term, we're selecting 10 others by end of year. And we were enabled to do so without having a fund-backed venture studio. And now we are launching soon to actually next week, a $225 million seed fund to back our venture studio and kind of continue that acceleration. So we did a venture studio backwards, but we gained a lot of really insightful learning through that advisory portion, our journey.
I mean, the other thing that we bring to the table is really the benefit of perspective for these early innovators about what good looks like, and also to help them understand where the gaps are in their programs and how we can actually help them address those. I've been involved with thousands of R&D programs over my career. I've put over 300 efforts into the clinic, probably helped launch around 25 new medicines on a global basis. And so sometimes it's very obvious to me. So even with groups that we don't choose to partner with, I'm happy to actually give them some advice about here are your key gaps, and here's how I would advise that you actually address those. Um, because I think that at times these early stage innovators don't have access to that kind of context, if you will. And for whatever reason, other people seem very reluctant to sort of spend some time in terms of giving some advice. And there may be reasons for that, but for me, it's like if we can help to lift the ecosystem, elevate the innovation possibilities, and potentially help some of these groups see their way forward into the clinic and beyond, that's a victory. I mean, there are just many great ideas that just sort of wither on the vine because teams can't raise money, they can't find the right people to work with, et cetera, et cetera. It's really kind of devastating in some ways. And as I was working with Nucleate teams, I could just see that there were a lot of great ideas that were going to struggle to actually get to that next step in the process, simply because, and it's very logical. I mean, I didn't know what I didn't know when I was starting out, coming out of academia. And so it's not surprising that a lot of other folks are in the same boat. And so being able to actually bring a very seasoned team who could precisely sort of weigh in and say, here are the things that are, you have a great scientific idea. We see the possibility. We can actually help you expand the horizons around the possibility, but we also see where some of the danger points are, and we can work with you to actually smooth those out. We can connect you to the right partners to enable your science. And so that's really sort of the ethos, if you will, of Persephoni. And we do this as full collaborators with the sponsors or the initiators of the technology. We're not interested in coming in and just grabbing the science and running with it. We actually want to be there walking in lockstep and acting as sort of like co-creators for the future journey. And I think it actually just makes for a better system. And then one of the upsides is that you're actually training more people how to do this, so that in turn down the line, they can actually do it themselves, but also teach others.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Also, this mentorship that people need in the beginning. So what would you say from your experience, what you saw, like you have almost 5 companies, which is great. What were the biggest mistakes that founders made? And also sometimes maybe misbeliefs that they took out from academia or from their time at Nucleate, but then they had to realize that's not how they thought, or like it doesn't work like they thought.
No, that's a great question. And certainly over the journey of Persephone, even Nucleate, there's been a lot of learnings even on my front of how to approach and assess. But one of the things I think has been top of mind is what is the overarching body of proof of concept of your technology while it is still in the academic setting, and that how that translates to value external. And what I mean by that is I've seen a lot of technologies exit at a non-technical related event. So a PhD student is graduating, or a PI is on a tenure track and ergo going to utilize the PhD student or postdoc or whoever else to match them with the technology. But it may mean that there's not actually sufficient proof of concept around that technology as it relates to the indication you're pursuing, right? And so that could be a vulnerability. And I would say if the first QC that I would ever engage with in exiting a technology, and executing an option is to make sure that you have access to all of the validated data that you have related to that technology to postulate it with the utmost amount of success and targeting the correct indication, not the disease area and subject of your PhD potentially, but it could be something alternative. So I would say that is one critical case. And then also in licensing. So it is no small feat to, entertain, if you've never done it before, it can be a scary thing to approach the tech transfer office and negotiate licensing. I wouldn't do it alone. I would do it with someone that's executed that before. Those terms will dictate the success downstream of your product. It may be, that you get this Series A, or you get to a commercial endeavor where you have deferred payments that cut too much of the margin, where you accepted terms right at the beginning that is unattainable to pharma to even actually engage with. And so unless you've seen it from downstream and approaching it earlier, and if you've never done that before, you might not know. So I would say ask trusted colleagues that have actually executed it, and go from there.
That's a great transition, Hilary. So with the current government situation, there have been a lot of cuts to grant funding, which is really the lifeblood for a lot of academic startups. Grant funding can be critical for, getting preclinical proof of concept or other key data points that I would say are instrumental for having a successful initial set of raises. So in this current environment with the NIH cuts and all universities are cutting staff, how would you suggest an entrepreneur give themselves the greatest chance of acquiring non-dilutive funding? And do you think this changes at what point an entrepreneur should leave a university setting if the grant funding landscape is getting more challenging?
Ooh. Bill, you want to tackle this one? I can follow on. This is our favorite topic right now.
Yeah, it really is. Personally, I think that while we're sort of going through this period of uncertainty, I'm sort of like coaching innovators to see that non-dilutive funding, at least from the federal government, is sort of like upside as opposed to relying on it. And in some ways, it actually may, in a weird way, help accelerate the expansion on their technology, because we've seen some groups that basically have had serial, like say SBIRs, and it just slows things down. But it's really about how to understand how to position the value statement for your technology, and then also understanding that different stakeholders are going to actually be looking for very different things. Some of the companies that we've actually interacted with have been very confused by the interactions they've had with venture groups, with pharma, et cetera. And I think at times they've been very tempted to follow sort of like the latest bit of advice, as opposed to stepping back and saying, what was our original thesis here for how we were going to try to create value? And then how do we craft our argument to actually move in that direction? I mean, I think ultimately groups are going to be incented to actually work with organizations like ours in terms of helping them sort of navigate this new space, because there is a hunger for investment from investors in smart ideas, but they're much more critical in terms of pressure testing the thesis, if you will, about how strong is the science, when will risk be discharged, what do those value inflection points look like. And another thing is they're going to look to see whether the innovators are actually highly coachable, which means, they're going to ask questions and then they're going to actually sort of integrate that perspective that they're hearing back from folks that are interested in actually investing. And oftentimes that can make a big difference between success and failure. But yeah, it's a tough time. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. And it is very distressing, not just for the folks who are in academia, but also for the totality of industry that is trying to grapple with this, what will end up being a major discontinuity in innovation in this country. There's just no way of sugarcoating it. But let's use this as an opportunity to actually get stronger and sharper, as opposed to seeing it as, well, all is lost, because that's not a good path to go on.
Yeah. And, like you said, there definitely will be challenges and repercussions of this grant funding going away. I'm curious if you think, from the experience that you've had at Lilly, do you think that industry will step in a bit to fill in the gap in one way or another, either not necessarily through non-dilutive, but through earlier stages of investments and partnerships to step in where companies may fail currently without grant funding? Or what do you think? Like, yes, there will be a gap, and it sounds like there will be a shakeout potentially. A lot of entrepreneurs may face challenges actually achieving a spin out, like we're kind of alluding to. But curious if you think industry will step in and say, we're going to expand our non-dilutive grant funding. We're going to expand our early stage partnerships to at least keep some of this interesting technology continuing in development.
Yeah, well, it's always hard to speak on behalf of the industry and know what the future will hold. But I think that there will be genuine interest in terms of engaging in a much broader way. But what they will also be looking for is they will be looking for signals from the academic institutions that they're prepared to operate in a different manner in terms of making it a true collaboration. Oftentimes, collaborations between industry and academia is still very much sort of like an academic mindset process. As you give us grant money and we go do some additional science, and then we come back and then we'll talk about what the possibilities might be. I think that industry will be much more interested in actually having direct engagement with those teams. I lived one of those experiences with one university. It was actually wonderful. The company benefited, but the scientists that were training at that university actually benefited tremendously because they got to work on science that really mattered to customers, but it also taught them what good looked like. And it was a very collaborative environment where industry was not steering what was being done, but were guiding their academic colleagues in terms of these are the things that people would really value. Mm-hmm. Can we actually do this? And it was within a very broad strategic envelope as opposed to very discrete points. So it also required labs to collaborate across that academic institution in a way that they had never done before. So I actually think that they benefited quite a bit from it. And so I think that you will see more of those models. But I think that, many academic institutions are probably going to be a little bit worried about the implications of what that might mean. And I think in this new evolving environment, all of us are just going to have to be prepared to actually try experiments as scientists. That's what we're supposed to be doing anyway. And try to make something positive happen out of this.
No, certainly. What is this saying? It's not the way the wind blows, it's how you cast your sails. And you'll look at trends in business as a whole and different upticks and whatnot. There's always opportunity to be captured, but what is the net that you're casting? And that may seem cliche in this dark time, but one of the things that has been a personal passion piece of mine from my experience of being an entrepreneur in residence and even within Nucleate is when you look at the micro and macroeconomics of early research as it relates to public funding, supporting, and then you have high throughput universities that have high revenues on returns, royalties, dividends, etc., from companies that have spun out. There's a key differentiator on the sustainability of those institutions, of those that double down on innovation. And so what it is also is a signal that the universities that are at greatest risk are the ones that may have not enabled or may not have had all the tools to support innovation, even though the technology is there. And so we've actually launched a sponsored program where we call it a fracture off of our venture studio and create a residency within universities, lending to having that commercial lens. But just as Bill articulated, the collaboration in that culture is really important. So there's things in any space that you can control things, and there's things that you can control and there's things that you cannot. We can't control the NIH at this moment and the immediate capital, but what can you control? Are there things in a university setting that you can change to make it a little bit easier or more streamlined to enable commercialization, right? So speaking on the tech transfer, so I think it is a call to action to private sector. I know colleagues of mine out of Utah that upon the announcement very quickly pulled together with colleagues a $30 million fund to replace SBIRs, focused on the Utah, ecosystem. I think it's a call to action, and we're working on some things in supporting rare disease and various things for missed opportunities. But I think it is time where those that have won in pharma, exit successful, that have benefited from that mechanism, to begin to engage and support early inventors in some capacity, like private serving public. is what I would advocate for and what we are doing.
That's really great that you're working on university partnerships and coming up with a creative model, even within Persephoni, to play a new role as things shift. And you both have touched on this a lot already, is that there is a very big difference between academic research versus commercial-oriented research in terms of the lens that you look at, in terms of, you know, the breadth of things that you consider when you're thinking about science and a commercial perspective versus advancing the pure science. And you've touched on this a bit, both of you, in terms of that difference in approach. And it sounds like the silver lining of this is that there will be more public-private partnerships and opportunities to advance innovation out of universities moving forward.
I think there will be. I think that both private and public will have to recalibrate their approach to each other in order to make this really work. And I actually think it's a good thing, because I think it'll actually increase the opportunities on both sides. But it also has to be done with a mindset of understanding that academia and industry do have different niches, if you will. And it would be dangerous to assume that one is going to sort of drive the other. Industry will not thrive in the long run without academia. And for academia or academic environments that aspire to see their ideas flourish in some way for society, it will most likely go through some kind of industry partnership. But I think at times there have just been, I don't know, it's not so much barriers. I just think that there's not necessarily been the right channels to actually make that happen. Technology transfer offices tend to be very understaffed. And as a result, that kind of throttles the bandwidth, if you will. That is a big source of frustration. I think that universities probably are going to need to invest more in terms of intellectual property filings, so that to make what it is that they produce look more attractive to industry as well. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be a little bit of a different mindset.
That makes sense. And, you know, this is something, Bill, what you just said and what Hilary was saying earlier about IP. I'm curious, what do you think the most important steps are that an entrepreneur should take? What are the most important considerations? And let's say the most common missteps that you see in terms of how entrepreneurs navigate IP. Obviously, universities do have a lot of leverage in terms of retaining ownership or retaining royalties on the IP that comes out. But it's, to my understanding, finding the right balance so that there's an incentive for an entrepreneur to build a company, and so that the terms are not so restrictive that it prevents investors from supporting the company and from the company advancing. So curious your perspectives on just the most important pieces of advice for someone coming out of Nucleate, for example, that's working on getting IP. Sometimes I've heard of options being used. Sometimes I've heard of like full straight out licenses from the beginning. Curious on the common missteps, common things that you see over and over again.
We could do a whole podcast on this.
Good.
And I don't say it in a negative way. I say it's just one of the most critical components. One thing, and certainly if you are a PhD or postdoc with the intent of spinning out your company, and if your PI or otherwise has inventorship, is getting endorsement and enrollment of that individual, typically universities defer for licensing to that individual. And it's also a defense or competitive advantage to that end to kind of put up some firewalls of any, call it requirements of publishing or call it limiting future publishing. Part of which is when you look at the academic research that's done, a large majority, and Bill touched on this on patents, is getting sufficient coverage. So you may be doing academic work in a non-desirable indication space or disease setting. However, the technology could have purpose in a more commercially viable or distinct area. And that is what you want to pursue. If you're not getting sufficient patent coverage on filings and near-term the data to further and bolster up that patent, our general counsel calls it an onion, but I struggle with it. I like to call it building the moat. you need to define what your areas of future operation, like operating capacity is within that. So that's a limitation, is, are you licensing enough IP around it? And is it in the space that are you qualified to pursue that space is primary number one, I think.
Yeah, I think the other thing is that entrepreneurs need to be thinking about a longer term patent strategy as opposed to thinking that they have the killer patent application up front. That's just the beginning, if you will. And then, very importantly, don't rely on your assessment of freedom to operate or what your cousin told you is your level of freedom to operate. I mean, I hear this all the time, is that we've done an assessment, and I'm like, have you really? You need to have somebody who actually has experience in doing this, and you kind of get what you pay for. And I've seen people get a lot of very bad advice along the way, even in industry, not just people coming out of academia. And it's always quite sobering when that moment comes when they realize that for some investment of time and energy and some money up front, they could have saved themselves a lot of heartaches, because now they're kind of locked out of Europe, because now their own art is actually prior art against themselves, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And I guess this is one other thing, is that if you aspire to really see your ideas blossom, don't just focus on the US. Think about what will have to be done OUS as well, mm-hmm. because it is a very different landscape. Now, it's a balance. You can't do everything, but you really have to think, once again, building backwards with the end in mind as to where you hope to see this technology go.
That's really helpful advice. So keeping the end in mind, having the broadest possible use of the IP included, as well as thinking broader than just the US. So the theme, I guess, I'm seeing from you two is keep it as broad as possible. Really do your work up front on the IP. It pays dividends down the line. It's not something worth trying to cut corners on. It's really worth the time and investment to hire a competent IP attorney or find one that's willing to work for equity or something like that. It's worth the investment. Ultimately, it's critical to the business.
Well, absolutely, because you will actually limit your investor pool, particularly if you're aspiring to work with larger organizations, based on if you have limitations around either freedom to operate or geographic restrictions. I mean, the US is a very important market, but it is not the only market in the world.
I've also seen in the academic setting and just at operational level, and I'm a somewhat proud PhD college dropout. So I was a PhD in bioengineering and then started a company. And but to that end, is in an academic setting, buying materials, reagents off the shelf is common practice, and you do not give thought to limitations. And so your technology could have a core tech at its basis, a CRISPR program or some other type of modality in an academic setting to publish. It's a non-implication. However, in a commercial environment, preeminently identifying what the downstream licensing for use of that is critical. And I've seen that be an impedance where you've got a great program, but you've selected a core tech that is non-commercially viable because of costing downstream. And so, it's pressure testing. I think that's why being in an environment and having mentors around you that, I'd rather learn from someone else's mistakes than my own. It's critically important.
And that's a really helpful segue into thinking about mistakes that people make. We talked about IP mistakes, but curious from the technical side, from either of your perspectives, what have you seen as a common technical issue that's fairly general, but can apply across different platforms that you've seen, whether it's, selecting the right preclinical proof of concept or selecting the wrong, preliminary set of studies in the wrong indication? What do you see fairly commonly?
This could be another entire podcast.
We're happy to do it.
Well, I can take a stab. I would say probably one of the biggest misses that I've seen is doing sufficient diligence on route of delivery in a clinical environment, right? When you're doing in vitro or in vivo work in animal models, There's things even downstream with the FDA, like human factors, what it will be like when a human interfaces with that intervention and actually administers it, and how the patients receive it, and prescribing, etc. So much of that could be around route of delivery. Route of delivery also has like implications on dosing frequency. And you can pick an indication, and in a in vivo setting or in vitro, it could work really well. The data is just absolutely amazing. But if you can't get enough of the stuff in the place where you need it, you may not get good clinical outcome, right? And so thinking through that, even in the companies that we've assessed, incredible preclinical data, but route of delivery could be a limitation of the volume of that construct and where it needs to go. Or it's just not feasible to do an intradural injection or intrathecal injection for a pediatric monthly. Even though it works, it's just not feasible downstream.
Yeah, my first thought when you said that was neuro implications, right? Like having a casual brain surgery every month is not exactly the most pleasant of experiences. Although I assume for a lot of those startups, that's not necessarily the objective. When they're running those mouse studies, they think it's like, oh, like we're going to do this in the mouse study, but it'll change in humans and how we deliver it. But hard to think about that from a scalability perspective in terms of like, oh, just because you did it in the mouse, maybe this doesn't necessarily work if you switch the route of delivery when you scale up from small animals to large animals to humans. So it may, just because something works when you do, brain surgery in a mouse doesn't necessarily mean it will scale if you're, injecting it into the spine and doing intrathecal instead as you progress.
One other thing, actually, also, sorry, Bill, is collaborate. One of the things I've seen within Persephoni and being an EIR before, Nucleate, there's power with cross-pollination of value and like technology. For example, if you have a route of delivery, this great technology, there could be another early technology that could enable your technology to improve outcome or efficacy. And I think there's this sentiment, and I don't know, actually, I can't figure out why, is that we need to hold and retain as much as possible, both of equity, value, not share, not, under confidentiality, of course, but not share. And I think there's a lot of power in accelerating advancement when you work with others. And I would love to see more early biotech companies. For example, within our partnership and our outreach, we've identified and actually matched technologies together that could be a complement to each other, whether it's a diagnostic or a companion diagnostic in this technology or a route of delivery device. So I would say don't be unafraid to continue the networking and kind of plugging gaps with other people.
Yeah, I would say that one of the biggest issues also is probably, how do I put this? You have to understand what matters to patients at the end of the day. Is your approach actually going to truly create some kind of market improvement for them in terms of better efficacy, fewer side effects, et cetera? It's kind of like what constitutes disruptive change for them to the better, if you will. And can you do it in a way that is actually cost effective and allows for access? And is it being delivered in a way that they can actually use the technology as well? So it's got to be fairly straightforward. And then I also see groups get caught up in, well, we're the best in class or first in class in this particular mechanism. Patients don't care about the mechanism of action. They don't care whether it is a protein therapeutic or a small molecule. They just want to get better. And I think at times people get into these very sterile arguments about the superiority of their technical approach, and they lose sight of what really matters to patients and physicians. I remember very early on in my career in diabetes research, going on some sales rides with sales reps and talking to doctors and pharmacists. And I was just shocked at their perspective versus what we thought was the greatest science. And I mean, in hindsight, as I reflect upon those experiences, they were looking for very pragmatic solutions that they and their patients could utilize in a very straightforward manner. And it's just kind of like mind blown. It just gave me a very different perspective about how to approach creating medicines. And I think at times people get very caught up in what I call the beauty of the science and forget that there's actually another human being at the end of all of that process that they have to serve.
Yeah, that makes sense. Keeping the patient at the focus, whatever science you're doing, what is the ultimate goal? Keeping that in mind all throughout. That's definitely a theme that we've heard on all of our podcasts with all of our guests, is that it can be, what's the right word? You can be so separated and siloed away from the patient experience when you're in a lab or when you're in a startup or in a boardroom, that it's important to center yourself and make sure you have some visibility into what the patient experience is. Talk to people, talk to physicians, try to get visits so that you can get some exposure to who are you making your drug for? How are you trying to help?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, we're all going to end up being patients, and we will know many patients in our lives. So I always used to tell my scientists at Lilly, just start with your own personal experiences and the experiences of your family and see what issues people are dealing with. That's actually a good place to start. And then if you do have the opportunity to actually interact with patients that are perhaps not like, in your immediate vicinity, that actually just increases your knowledge. But at times it's just kind of like, how would I want this therapy to be delivered? You go back to the once monthly intrathecal injections. That who would sign up for that? I mean, I guess if it saved your life, sure. But I've had scientists say, well, because you can do this, patients will tolerate it. And I'm like, tolerating therapies is not the game.
Actually, Sam and anesthesia, that I just, one of the things that we do, and even in any of the indication spaces we're pursuing our companies, is we actually engage with the patient advocacy organizations and the scientific organizations around that. And it is partly of which, and when I was doing my PhD, I was studying pulmonary fibrosis. And so I attended the Idiopathic Pulmonary Fibrosis Conference. One, it was hugely motivating. Two, I was able to meet individuals that were, championing that disease indication, who upon, this technology actually advancing would have been the ones that would endorse it. And so it's an opportunity to meet a lot of stakeholders. There's also a significant amount of non-dilutive capital that comes from patient advocacy organizations that could be a bridge, dependent of some of the gaps and lapses in the SBIR funding right now, because they're very motivated to keep innovation continuing.
Yeah, that's a great idea for any of the entrepreneurs in our audiences, engaging with patient advocacy organizations or just attending their conferences and learning. And I assume there's patient experiences and patients talking about what their life has been like with the disease and what they're hoping for in a therapy. So as we think more about the future and the what's next after Nucleate, Hilary, I want to start with you. You helped play a big role in Nucleate scale globally. What's one piece of advice you give to someone who just finished the program with the Activator and is wondering what's next?
No, certainly. Well, I would say if you've participated in the Activator, then it may be a company, or you have to look at it through the lenses. What did you want to yield or gain from the Activator? And it is that you are forming a company or have done so, and you want to go through that exercise. Or are you doing so being formed with other business team members or scientists, etc., and wanting to test that hypothesis? Is that a fit for me? Like, am I meant for biotech, entrepreneurship, industry, etc.? So I think if you understand those two things, then, and in going through the program, I would say, what did you do to test that? So on the order of like networking, if you're wanting to pressure test industry, did you pointedly go after and seek connections within industry to ask questions, etc., and network? If it is on the, you are building a company, are you really pressure testing the utility of your business proposition? And are you willing to hear a no or a yes? And hopefully use the Activator to come to that conclusion. And then just freaking go. Sometimes, and we laugh at this at Persephone, sometimes it feels like we're up in the air in an airplane and it's going down, we're putting it together. And one of my most favorite quotes It's actually one of my dad's favorite. It's an entrepreneur will do for a time what others won't to have what others cannot for the long run. And so being an entrepreneur in biotech is not sexy. It is the hardest thing that you could ever do. There's so much unknown. You essentially go from a PhD where it's very controlled environment, prescriptive, you do what you're supposed to do, you test a hypothesis, you present your thesis, and then after that, biotech and starting a company is complete opposite. There is no form-fitting playbook. It is being creative, it is pivoting on your feet and being okay to pivot. And so I would say for anyone out of the accelerators, I hope that you got the answer that you wanted of which path you would want to take and that you don't stop. And like, if it's to be, it's up to me and you just go for it.
Yeah, I think it's really about being convicted to invest in yourself and others. There is the fear of failure that everybody sort of logically has about how things could go wrong, but it's very easy to talk yourself out of things. So, people talk about the three failures: failure to see, failure to act, failure to complete. You have to basically be willing to go for it and do everything that's within your power to try to make things happen, and also learn very rapidly along the way. And it's not for the faint of heart. I mean, if you're going into this entrepreneur space, there are going to be hard times. You're going to have to dig deep, and you're going to have a community that supports you. But I mean, it's worth it, because at the end of the day, you have the possibility of doing something wonderful that might actually change society. But if you don't have that conviction, or if you don't feel like you have gas in the tank to do that, maybe it's better to let others take the baton. I would say the same thing even in pharma. I mean, the people who are successful are the ones who just go for it and make the impossible possible. And, you look at back at it, and it's like, how could anybody have believed that they could actually do that? They just decided they were going to figure it out, and they weren't going to take no for an answer. And the no's usually start in people's own minds. People are usually their worst blockers. So it's about overcoming those hesitations, those doubts, and just doing the things that you really want to do, and then do your very best.
I love that advice. And, the themes that I've been hearing throughout the podcast, the skills are important: technical skills, scientific insight, business skills. As much as anything else, it's about a mindset and how you're approaching things. Seems to be equally, or if not more important, about keeping the end in mind first, keeping the patient at the center of everything that you do, having conviction in your ideas, and being willing to take the risk to push them forward as much as you can, and think creatively and on your feet in order to do that.
Yeah, I would add one last thing.
Please.
Failure is not a setback, it is a lesson. And so you have to understand that in this business, you are going to fail a lot, hopefully not fatally, but you will have many failures along the way. It's really learning from those and using those as rocket fuel for the future. I see a lot of people who get down on themselves because things didn't go well. Trust me, I have failed many more times than I have succeeded. I learned over time to actually use those failures as lessons that made me better and better. But you're going in the moment, you will still feel that sort of like emotional pain of disappointment, etc., that things didn't go so well. But it's really about picking yourself up, asking yourself, what is it that you've learned from this, and then continuing to push forward. It's a growth mindset. It's a not taking no for an answer. I mean, it's what fuels champions. You look at the greatest athletes. I mean, many of them are quite gifted from an athletic ability, but the ones who really excel are the ones who have the toughest mindsets.
No, for sure. And one thing I will add to all of that, which is absolutely true, and I feel wholeheartedly, is you can't do it alone. One of the most important choices that you have to make is, who are your co-founders? Who are you choosing to build this company with? Do you trust them? Do you like them? You're going to spend a lot of time together. You're going to get mad at each other. Can you communicate? all of those things that are entirely unrelated to the technology, etc. And, there's plenty of statistics out there, but I've seen it enough is that the large majority of therapies not reaching to the clinic are business failures, not technology failures. And we can see that at large scale, large tech to small, medium, those that never even got kickstarted off. And a large majority and portion of those is predicated on the team that you build. And you work so hard on the technology, pick your team and pick them good. And if there's not fit, sometimes and I know there's going to be CEOs listening to this, you have to make very tough decisions. I would say in early company translation and formation, you're doing so with your friends that you went to school with, or what have you, or those that proximity of resources and people. But there will be times that those individuals will not be the right person to participate in that same level. And that's also a critical component of being a CEO of a company. It's not fun. Being a leader, endeavoring, it can be one of the loneliest things you could ever do. But if you have your core team in lock and heading in the same direction, I think that's where magic can happen.
Fantastic. And I think that's all really great advice for the entrepreneurs and activator teams in our audience. So just to close out on a lighter note, curious, Hilary, Bill, what do you like to do in your free time that's not biotech related? We talk about this a lot, is that this is a very focused, all-consuming passion for a lot of people. But it's important to take time for family. Hilary, I see a picture in your background with your, was that your daughter? I can't tell from back here. But,
she's a cutie.
So keeping family in mind and even hobbies too. So any final words on life outside of biotech and keeping yourself energized and refreshed?
Well, I would say it's my little one right there, Natalie. She keeps me pretty busy, and I hard and fast actually. So we're crazy busy right now, but I think setting apart time for those rejuvenation. So I have, as a mom and a founder and busy, I have a strict guideline from that time that little girl wakes up in the morning until she's to school. It's no business. And when she gets back from school until she goes to bed, it's no business. Now, it may mean that I don't get very much sleep at night because there's a lot to get done, but it's a big priority. And then being outside. So I would say those two things.
Yeah, you really have to pay very close attention to your emotional and mental health, which will ultimately impact your physical health, but also impact your effectiveness. So for me, I have 4 grandchildren. Some of them are actually upstairs, and thankfully they're being quite quiet. I told them I was doing this podcast. I'm always a little nervous because the 3-year-old is pretty crazy right now. He's just a little bit younger than Natalie is. And then it's also about having some hobbies, do things that you actually enjoy. It's actually good to take a break. Mm-hmm. It's mental rest. It also restores you. So if you enjoy the outdoors, enjoy the outdoors. I garden. I actually have some other interesting hobbies that I indulge in. And it's what keeps me sort of like balanced. But I will tell that the folks who are listening to this podcast, family and friends are everything. Do not sacrifice that simply to be successful. You might be successful, but you will not live a full life. We can all think of examples of individuals who are lauded as titans of industry, and they've lived to regret the fact that, they didn't build a bond with their children, or their personal lives became shambles because of that obsession. You have to find a way to balance, and it is possible to do it.
Bill keeps me in check. It's really nice.
I just have a few more years of experience about making those same mistakes myself as I pass on the advantage of the learning. Yeah. Some of those lessons.
I love that. And also goes to the theme that we've talked about all along, is that you can learn from other people's mistakes, yeah, and you don't have to go through all the mistakes for yourself. So always good to learn from those around you.
Yeah. Yeah. Circling back to Hilary's comment about being with a team you trust, that's incredibly important. honestly, what I have seen over the years is that the teams that worked well together and who could actually work well with others, they were the ones that succeeded. I've seen some great technologies, some great startups fail because they had so much tension and spent so much time dealing with that, or they could not work well with partners, that it just caused everything to be a distraction. And I've seen teams that were up against impossible problems that people thought were just like ridiculous things to work on, but they were an awesome team and they made it happen. And so one of the other things that entrepreneurs should understand, that particularly from the lens of experienced investors, they're going to be pressure testing the team as much as the technology. In some ways, the quality of the team, how well that team works together, how that team is able to interact with other external groups is almost more important in some ways than the technology itself, because it is a strong predictor of future success.
That's fantastic advice. And this has been a fascinating conversation. We really enjoyed it. I know our audience will too. And there's so much to learn from both you, Hilary and Bill. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having us.